wonderful throng here, and look forward to your talk. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for the great welcome I've had here in Australia, but particularly by your council and this particular part of the tour. It's a great honour for me to be here, and I'm one of the first Lord Lyons to decide that Edinburgh is not the only stomping ground for a Lord Lyon. And that includes parts of Scotland. I've taken the Court of the Lord Lyon to Glasgow and to Dundee and sat formally in the court there, but I've also done a lot to try to move out to different parts of the world and keep in touch. One of the difficulties I have is that, in fact, I don't know how to shut up. And being a lawyer and a clergyman, I know how to talk, so I've got an opportunity to go forward. But I was asked to talk about the office of Lord Lyon, and it's a very historic and significant office within the life of Scotland. And my jurisdiction as Lord Lyon is simply to Scotland, but also to those with Scottish descent and Scottish connections overseas. And I'd be very keen to take the first part seriously, but also the second part, to say that in fact that the living Scotland in this century involves those of Scots descent, whether they be in Edinburgh or whether they be in Canberra or in Tasmania for that matter. It doesn't really matter to me that I think there's an inclusiveness in Scottish life that needs to move forward. But let me tell you a little bit about the office itself. I used to start this presentation by saying that the first recorded minute of the Lord Lyon was in the minutes of Arbroath Abbey in 1318 at the inauguration of the abbot who presided over the declaration of Arbroath, and that's there. I delivered this particular address to a group of school children, high school children in Aberdeen, and after I said that, a little boy of about 13, 14 with curly hair stuck his hand up. And I wasn't going to ask him why, because I thought he was going to ask me, can I go to the toilet? That's what I thought was going to happen. And it was a big hall, so I ignored him. So he stuck his hand up and he kept waving at me. So I stopped and I said, what is it? He says, you're wrong. So I said, why was I wrong? He said, because his grandfather had told him I was wrong. So I said foolishly, who's your grandfather? And he said, my grandfather is the Earl of Elgin in Kincardine. And then I knew I was wrong. Because Lord Elgin is one of the most eminent historians that we have of Scottish tradition. And in their records of the Bruce family, there's a letter from Robert the Bruce ascribing the office of Lord Lyon in 1306 to a James or Jack Capenny. So I now have to start this talk by saying, corrected by a 14-year-old, the first recorded. But it's an ancient office, and there's been a continued Lord Lyon ever since. But I don't think that the office of Lord Lyon necessarily stays in that medieval period, and that's where the links with the heraldry take place, which I'll get to a little later in this talk. But it goes back into the Celtic period of the kind of 10th to 12th century of the office of the Royal or High Shenanigans. Now don't ask me to spell that word, it's Gaelic, but it's very difficult to spell, and there's about half a dozen different spellings for it. Each of the Gaelic scholars will tell you they're right. I don't know who's right basically, but I know it's called Shenanigans. And the High or Royal Shenanigans was the king's genealogist who recited for 9 generations who the next King of Scots or the King of Alba should be. And it was a very important part that family history was actually recited. And so the office of Lord Lyon mixed together that Celtic idea of the Shenanigans, or the keeper of the family history in the oral tradition, but also moved into this idea that they were there to be the Lord Lyon, or those responsible for the ensigns and symbols of actually monarchy and honour through the grant of arms. So a very ancient office indeed. I have 3 responsibilities. One is to look after and grant new heraldic arms to people, and we do that all the time. I have 11 heraldic arms outstanding at the moment for people in Australia, because they've actually decided that they wanted to have Scottish arms. I should say that we're much better value than the College of Arms in England, if you want to come to us. Much better than people. And we have two tests. First of all, can I gain jurisdiction over the person who wants arms? And that generally is of this Scottish descent. But also you need to be a well-deserving and virtuous person. Now, I'm the sole judge of that. So any of you that have an amber bottle of a single malt type match what's necessary to get over that hurdle. That's a very serious point, although I do it comically, because this idea of a well-deserving and virtuous person is one of the tests. It's not to do with rank. It's to do really with what you are as a person. And for me, the whole question of the Scottish diaspora and Scottish celebration is about the values that we hold to. We all have different functions in life. All of those are important, but the values that we actually hold as a nation of Scotland, and also the values we hold as a family of the living Scotland worldwide, these values are important. Kinship, protection, care, equality, all these things mark what makes a Scot, in my view, and what makes a Scot in the world distinctive. That's why we were able to go as Scots to many parts of the world and establish this kind of network that you celebrate here in Australia. I was in Mumbai last year doing some work. I support an HIV orphanage there, and I won't go into that because I could talk all day about that. One of my pals who was a merchant banker, she gave it up. She was chief executive of a large merchant bank and gave it up and established this. Anyway, but to cut the story short, I bumped into a family, about 20 of them, and they were all Indians, all Hindus by birth, by religion, and they asked me to take a photograph of them. So I took the photograph, as we've done today, and I handed the camera or the phone back, and then I said, "What's your name?" And you could have blown me over a feather when they said their name was McPherson. And their great grandfather had been a merchant Scottish seaman who'd married an Indian lady and stayed. And this whole McPherson clan emerges from that particular aspect of the work. And that's to be celebrated. Now, there are those who would tell you that's maybe not what it's about. For me, that is what it's about. It's the internationalism of what it means to be a living Scot today and where that goes. So I grant arms all the time to Australians. The new set of arms, I've just granted arms to the faculty of the Emergency Medicine of Australia, but also I've also just granted arms to the President of the Legislative Council of Adelaide, the state of Adelaide, which is South Australia. And he hasn't quite got his parchment yet, or his letters patent, but he had the flag made with him when I went to visit him. So always remember, to fly the flag of Scotland. That's very important. The office itself nowadays has that heraldic role, but it also has a role to deal with the state ceremonial. So all the matters of Scotland that involve state ceremonial fall under my kind of guidance, and that's a wonderful thing, to be able to add the colour and the excitement and the history back into what our state life is at. And you just need to see, when you've got a group of soldiers out marching or whatever it may be, it adds to the feeling at all. And when I go back, one of the first duties I've got is to attend to Her Majesty and the Scottish Regalia, the Scottish Crown, at the 20th anniversary of the opening of the Scottish Parliament. So I'll be there in full robes, and the crown will be behind me, being carried by the Duke of Hamilton, who's the hereditary crown bearer of Scotland. It's a lovely thing to be able to share all that great national history with the world. And in Edinburgh, we have some great platforms to be able to do that, which everybody who is of Scots descent and well beyond is able to celebrate with us the colour that makes our history alive today. I've often described heraldry and ceremony as the garden of Scottish history. And what I mean by that is that the flowers are there. There are some rough flowers, there are some prickly flowers, but there's some beautiful flowers and there's some magnificent trees. And there's a whole plethora of growth that's part of that history that makes kind of Scotland still live today. Little side story. The first state ceremonial I took part in was the installation of the Governor of Edinburgh Castle. Now it takes place on the esplanade of Edinburgh Castle where you'll find the tattoo, but there's no tattoo stands there, and it's a very high-level military offence. I'm dressed in the regalia of the Lord Lyon, and the tabard is cloth of gold. So they put the microphone under the cloth of gold and it didn't work because the signals couldn't get out. So the very intelligent yet somewhat inventive corporal in charge of the speakers decided to strap it to the back of my head. So with a big bit of sticky tape, he stuck the thing on the back of my head, tucked my bonnet on me, and the antennae just came out of the back. Worked perfectly. Army solution, absolutely worked perfectly. I did the ceremony and then I marched up to the drawbridge with a little group of soldiers to receive the keys to bring back down to give to the new governor. And I passed a group of girl guides in their early teenagerhood, and one turned to her mother and said, "Mum, Mum, look at that man, he's like a Teletubby, he's got an antennae at the back of his head." So even in the most solemn occasions, and the most solemn occasions were brought down to earth. Of course, the difficulty for me is I'm a giggler and trying to keep a straight face. But it's a great joy to take part in these very solemn and also serious manifestations of what Scotland means in terms of its statehood and nationhood through the ceremonial. And then the other role that I have is basically I'm a general advisor to those who require to have information about the ceremony or about the genealogy or about families of Scotland or protocol. And I'm often asked questions about who takes precedence over who, and this kind of question. If you ever ask yourself the question of who takes precedence over who, then in fact the Scots answer is you've got it wrong, you get behind them. Because I think that's not the question that really we take as being significant in today. We celebrate everybody's achievements, we celebrate the Scottishness, and we move forward. So the office itself is in New Register House, opposite the Balmoral for those of you who've lived there, next to the Guildford pub for those of you who like real ale. So it's a very good pub. We've got a very small staff, so we're unable to do research for you, but we will try and build up bits and pieces of information for you, and some of you have been to the office. The research, I would love to be able to say, somebody to say, can you go and research this for us, but we just don't have the facility. We grant a fair number, and I've doubled the number of grants that are done in a year, and as Lord Lyon, I've probably promoted more chiefs and commanders to the clans than probably any previous Lord Lyon since Thomas Innes. And the reason for that is that I very fundamentally understand that a clan can only be a clan if they have a chief. I mean, they're an association with very disparate views without the particular focus of the chief. And so, for example, I'm very pleased, after a long and difficultly argued case before me, which was done judicially, the Buchanans now have a chief. And I'm convinced that, in fact, the evidence produced for me was sufficient to prove he was of the bloodline. And that's all that needs to be established at that level. But for another example, the McGilverys have not had a chief for a long time. So I've asked them, they asked for a family convention. They were given a family convention under my supervision, and they've appointed a commander. What I'm pleased about, he's 30-ish, and at least in good looking, so there's a very strong chance of being able to have the next generation if he gets made chief. So you need to be able to keep the kind of, it's not a matter of a lottery. We try to establish these lines. So these are two examples of how the family conventions go on. At the moment, I think the Bairds have got a family convention going to look for a chief, and I can't think of the other one. But what I do is I appoint a supervising officer, who's one of my officers at arms, who goes out and he makes sure it's fair and transparent. It's the clan or the family who choose, but I need to verify that it's done fair and above board and give an externalisation to them. As for the role of Scottish heraldry internationally, there's a huge talk there in itself. We have the St Andrew's Society of Bangkok with arms, and their arms are the saltire with a Buddhist temple on the bottom of it. So very clearly that. Equally, the Scottish Utah Association have just been granted arms. They have a saltire at the top of their shield, and the beehive, which is the sign of the state of Utah, the busyness of the bees and the industrial aspects of Utah. And above it, they have a hand holding the dog rose, the flower of Utah, and the thistle. So there's a lot of heraldry used by people overseas to represent their links home, and that's a regular occurrence for me to grant heraldic arms. Now remember, arms, whether to an individual or a group, is an honour. It's a direct prerogative of the sovereign, and the sovereign passes that in the Scottish terms to me by way of direct responsibility. Should never take that back, it always rests with the wrong line. But it is an honour to have that identity, to show that you belong to the family network of Scottish heraldry. And any of you interested, we've got local heraldrists here that are very interested in kind of developing a kind of more interest here. Stephen Zabo is very, very helpful in all this particular field. Now, with regard to Scottish history, one of the things I've often found about historians, and with respect to the historians this here, is that there are two groups. There are those that want to allow the knowledge, or the fountain of the knowledge of history, to keep bubbling. And that's, for me, the model. You've got to be able to keep looking at it and discovering. There are those who suffer from an academic constipation, and they're so certain about what the facts are that they've lost really what's behind it. And each bit of our Scottish history, whatever time you look at it, is simply just a kind of bubbling of the facts, the figures, and the excitement of the age. I thought what Katie did last night in her talk was remarkable on two levels. One was that I thought, three levels. I thought her idea was novel and actually new. Secondly, I thought that she presented it absolutely beautifully with a mixture of insight, communication skills at the highest level, and a touch of humour. And thirdly, I thought actually that she captured an aspect of the growing history, or the bubbling history, that I think is absolutely essential. She didn't say, this is what it was like. She actually said, this is what I've discovered, and here's what the views are. And that's the nature of Scottish history for me, is it's a bubbling fountain that pops up all sorts of new discoveries at every aspect of life. Not a great lover of uncertainty. My experience is that I grew from being a very certain and focused young man to someone who's in early old age beginning to just enjoy the mellows of life, and actually enjoy the mellows of the history as well. So don't get too focused on your historical studies, but actually see it as a discovery of who you are within that history. And particularly within clan and family activity, there is often such a certainty about things that actually I find uncomfortable as a Scot at home to hear interpreted anywhere else, even in Scotland, but even beyond that, in a way that creates a kind of line drawn in history. So enjoy it, embrace it, study it, but let the bubbles of the fountain of history come alive. I've often thought that what does history do for us in these bubbles is actually brings the taste to our living Scotland today. And that's what kind of the analogy I would encourage you to do with the history. One of the things I'm always amazed about is that there is a general view that the Lord Lyon is omnicompetent with regard to Scottish history. I don't think there's ever been a Lord Lyon that was able to do that, because I discover bits of Scottish history every time I go out and do something like this in a different part of the world or in a different part of Scotland. We do have some up-and-coming new family conventions. The Baird's been one, and they've moved towards a chief of the name and arms. Now, I'm going to talk tomorrow about this, but I don't appoint the chiefs. What I do is I ratify them against the chief of the name and arms of. And that's what I would do with a Scottish title. They get registered against the chief of the name of the arms of. And that's very important, but it actually has the effect of appointing. It's just that you do it that particular way. So if we find a base arms for the Bairds, when they come up with a person who's the commander, they'll stay in place for a little while, and then what we'll do, by a little while, that could be 5 to 10 years. It's, in family life, it's not 3 months, it's a longer process. Then what we might do is we might then move towards a chief. The one chief I had great delight in appointing was Ian Gunn as the chief of the guns. He had been the commander for some 40 odd years, and they wrote to me and asked me to appoint him for another 5 years, and I wrote back in my usual style to say no, and they got very upset and asked what Ian had done. So I wrote back again. I just let them on. I just wrote back and said he'd done nothing. And they wrote back and said, well, why are you not appointing him? It's because I said, I want you to make the request for me to appoint him as chief. It's time we moved it on. But it's their decision, and that illustrates how it's their decision. So there's a lot of that work. And as I've explained to you, I've probably created more commanders and more chiefs than any Lord Lyon, and that's not something that's going to go away, because there is a piece of case law which a judge once said that he found the idea of a clan without a chief to be quite an anathema, and I think that's correct. You need to be able to identify it and see who that's got to be. You've got several chiefs here in Australia, so for example, so it's wonderful to see them spread throughout the world, and to see the sharing of that Scottish history. My last little bit was to address you on what are the new directions. Well, first new direction is I'm trying to speed up the process of grant of arms, and we're now, when I go back, the only petitions I've got to deal with for arms will be those petitions that have come in since I came to Australia. So we're into real time. Depending on the complexity, I can get through the petitions in about 3 months, but then we need to wait for the painters, and there just aren't any heraldic painters around. Those of you who've got arms will see how beautiful the documents are, and they're just very difficult to get someone of that detail to do it. So you just need to have, that's the delay. But once you've been given the warrant, you can use it, and that's why Andrew McLaughlin in Adelaide was able to run up the flag when I was visiting there. So that's one development. Another development is, and this is not and I just have to say this straight out, it's not a criticism of past approaches, because everybody thinks it is, but I want to further open the office for people to be able to come in, feel they can take part in it and come into the office itself. So we try very hard to welcome visitors, but we've got restricted access. We also try to let you see the registers if you come, and again if there's staff there. But one of my big projects is to attempt, before I finish, to digitise all the records. That's the court records as well as the recordings, and to make them available to the world free. Now I've got ideas how I'm going to do that, and we're very blessed at home if you can persuade them that we have a heritage lottery fund, and it produces large sums of money. So it's not that I'm looking for money, I'm actually looking for the right kind of idea to capture them, to do it. And what we might look for for people like yourselves is to sign up as kind of founder members of the foundation, but we're not looking for you to send checks. We're just looking for you to be actually a kind of base, an international base, and I'll explain that in due course. So that's another development. A development, of course, that needs to be noted is that we lost Mrs. Elizabeth Rhodes after 43 years' activity in the office, and she was a knowledge of all sorts of activity. So we're moving the office over with regard to its knowledge base, because she'd met probably 2 or 3 generations of people in the same family over the period that she'd been there, and that made a big difference. The final direction, which is one I can't talk too much about, is that we have this thing in Scotland called a feudal barony. Do people understand what that is? It's a kind of residual feudal title that can be bought and sold. And it's done on a private register, and it's separate now from the land. It used to be linked with the land. It's a bit like a piece of intellectual property. And these are being bought by people all over the world, but bought for large sums of money. And they then come to me and ask me to recognise them. I'm not into that, and so therefore I ceased to recognise them. And I'm getting sued in the court at the moment to make me recognise them. Now, the outcome's yet to come. The last hearing was on the 19th of June. Was that passed?
Next week.
Next week. It was next week. 19th of June. It's the last hearing of it, and then the judge will decide. But it's a kind of contentious area. It's not that I mind people buying these titles and actually enjoying them, but it's when they actually want some formal recognition for something you've bought. Seems to me not to be something I'm comfortable with. It's like the question I've been asked a number of times on this trip. I've bought a square foot of Glencoe. Am I the Laird of Glencoe, and can I call myself my Laird? I have to bite my tongue to say, are you daft, basically? If I buy that steak, which would be more than $10 or £10, I'm not buying the whole cow, basically. So it's and people genuinely think that in fact they've got some kind of proprietorial claim on these titles. From my point of view, the souvenir titles are something to be celebrated. I have 3 square meters of the Brazilian rainforest, but it's because I'm interested in ecology and natural history, which many of you will have heard. I don't think I own a bit of the rainforest. I just have some way of contributing to it, and it's a lovely certificate to get that you've got a bit of Glencoe. But when people write and say they want to have their passports changed to be put on Laird of Glencoe, I kind of just, So while it's in the same area, in a much more ridiculous, a much more de minimis area from the feudal baronies, I have the same view about that. The court will give me a direction on it, which they're entitled to do, and then I'll have another look at it. But I'm minded to have another look at it even more seriously than I have, if in fact the court goes against me on it. But that's not a threat to the court. It's just I think I need to get this actually captured. Why do I take that direction when my previous Lord Lyon's haven't gone? Because in the past these things went with the land and the estates. So, and that was fine, because if you owned the land and you were called, John Smith of X, that was fine with me. But it's when you actually you take it away and you're able to buy and sell it, and so that's probably a new development. So that's where we are. The office itself is probably in a great healthy state, and we've got a lot of contacts throughout the world. And I've taken the view, as I've said earlier, to be someone who goes out and actually gets to meet people. And I never find people tiring. I got all sorts of warnings about people I would meet in Australia. None of you here. They were going to bend my ear. I was quite content some of them, and some of them are the most interesting, stimulated people with a story that I might not have agreed with, but it was a story that was worth telling. And I think what you do in this council and in this Scotland Week is to tell the story of Scotland here. And I congratulate you for it, and I thank